Good afternoon to those of you who are in the East. Good morning if you're in the Central, Mountain, or Western time zones. I'm Mark Morial. I'm CEO of the National Urban League. Proud to be with you today as we convene this meeting of the Black Census Roundtable. I want to thank a number of people for joining us this morning. All Black Roundtable members, thank you for joining. The Lawyers Committee attendees, thank you for your leadership and engagement. All Urban League affiliates across the nation, your work is special. Your work is instrumental. I want to thank every presenter. I also want to thank both Jerry Green and Jericho Richardson of the National Urban League team, as well as Reverend Patrick Young, for all of their work and their engagement in preparation for this roundtable meeting today. I want to also thank Congressman Stephen Horsford of Las Vegas and Nevada, who's just been an absolute powerful advocate for us from the standpoint of his role as a member of Congress and the Congressional Black Caucus's point person on census issues. I also want to do some acknowledgments. During 2020, the Black Census Roundtable and all of our partners, Melanie Campbell of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation, who's a co-convener of this, Latasha Brown, the co-founder of Black Voters Matter, of course, Stacey Abrams, the founder of Fair Count and Fair Fight, Nana of Baji, the former CEO of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and now President Biden's nominee to become Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Kristen Clark, the Divine Nine, especially across the board. Delta Sigma Theta's national president has attended these roundtable meetings, and representatives of all of the Divine Nine have been engaged in this effort. This has been a united effort on behalf of people all across the Black community, the African-American community, the African diaspora in the United States, the Caribbean diaspora in the United States. Across the board, we've been united to work very hard. Now, why are we here today? Is the census over? Census operations have ended. The census is not over. Black Roundtable members, the census is not over. And in the 2020 census, we had the pandemic, we had Black Lives Matter protests, hurricanes, the presidential election, unprecedented political interference and weaponization from the former president of the United States. This roundtable discussion is not to rehash the challenges we had to navigate. This gathering is about looking forward. And what are the critical points for our discussion? What we need to know about the Black count. How accurate is the data? We want to talk about the quality of the data and its impact on equal representation, redistricting, apportionment, federal funding allocations, COVID-19 response, rebuilding post-COVID, and we want to talk about Black Roundtable data quality priorities. What is next? Census operations have ended. The census is not over. So we ask you to commit 1 hour. We're going to be as efficient as possible. So you can raise your hand in the Zoom and we'll work to get to you. But we want to be efficient. There's a lot to cover. There are many of you who are on the phone. We appreciate your work. We appreciate the collaboration, and our work continues. Before I move on, I want to note, we made a decision late in the census to file a federal lawsuit against the United States Census. I would have never imagined at the beginning of this process that we would have to bring a federal lawsuit against the census. And I especially want to thank the many co-plaintiffs who worked with us on that lawsuit. And I especially want to thank the Lawyers Committee and the lawyers that they assembled, the legal team that they assembled. Thank you, Kristen Clark. Thank you, Damon Hewitt, for what you did to assemble a great team of lawyers who, in the end, we got a temporary restraining order to stop the census from ending. We extended it an additional 15 days. And with the consent decree we just negotiated, we were able to stop many of the Trump administration's last minute shenanigans, which were designed to simply undermine the integrity of the census. So I want to especially emphasize that point and give great appreciation. There's nothing like having talented, if you will, passionate, detail-oriented lawyers. We also ended up being assigned to a judge who was fair and opened, understood our arguments, and were persuaded by our arguments. So I want to say thank you to each and every one of those who participated in that effort. Now let us move to our co-convener today, our friend, our sister, and our ally, Melanie Campbell, President and CEO of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation. She is going to talk about now what? We mobilize for the census, we mobilize for the vote. What's next? Melanie
Hi,
Campbell.
Mark. I'm going to apologize. I can't be physically on the screen today. I'm just where I can't do that. But first, I want to thank you for your leadership and your partnership and your passion on this issue and all you bring. And it's been always an honor and a pleasure to partner with you. If ever I'm gonna get in a foxhole with somebody, you first one I'm gonna call, right? And we, quite frankly, together. And of course, my sister Jerry Green and everyone here, and Damon and everyone. Mark, you kind of really laid it out. We know this, I guess, third census, where I've had some element of responsibility to try to engage our community. And so what's also been so very different is the kind of administration that managed that, or in this case, mismanaged that. And so the reality about what this means for our community and resources, like I'll be preaching to the choir when I see all of the names and faces on here, but just for us to reiterate the need to remember that the census never stops. The process never stops. I think, Mark, the last time we worked together in 2010 is like that whole idea of, and then Jerry, you were still inside of the Bureau at the time, how important it is that our community shows up over the next 10 years, not just when it's a couple years out and we know we got to get ready for the count, but the process has already begun for 2030. And then knowing that right now we have to worry about what's going to happen and how we agitate Representative Horsford from the outside in and the inside out to make sure that whatever adjustments need to be made, we know there's going to be undercount, and we know our community is going to be most impacted by that undercount for resources, for dealing with our political power, dealing with our economic opportunities, entrepreneurship, and so many more things that we all know. And so for me, I think that's, I did want, and I think Joshua Gray, Mark, I wanted to introduce you to our, to this group, our new Vice President for Strategic Alliances and Policy, Joshua Gray. And so Joshua is a HBCU graduate from Howard University, but he started out some years ago as an intern, has done some awesome things over time, and he's now on our team and will be very active, Jerry, with us to make sure that we stay engaged. So thanks again, Mark, and looking forward to hearing some more about what we need to do next.
Melanie, thank you for your leadership. And I understand that Damon Jerry is not with us this morning.
Yeah, that's right, Mark. He can't join us this morning.
Yeah, and keep Damon in your prayers. He lost his dad. Lonnie Hewitt, a great New Orleans architect and someone that I actually have known longer than I've known Damon. So keep Damon in your prayers this morning. Speaking of praying, let us go to Reverend Patrick Young. Reverend Young, now a member of the Urban League team as a special advisor. is the pastor of the First Baptist Church in East Elmhurst, Queens, in New York City. Reverend Young, please give us a word of inspiration and a prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal God, we thank you for life and the ability to move and have our being on this day and breathe. We thank you, God, for this opportunity to represent your people, for community and people, those who are locked out on palace of privileges and those who are locked out from doors of opportunities. We thank you, God, that we'll be a voice of the liberation in a time where we are dealing with challenges that are facing our various communities across these United States. Guide our hearts and guide our minds in this conversation. And we ask your blessing upon the Hewitt family as they deal with loss and grief. Comfort them even now. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you very much, Reverend Young. Appreciate you. Now I'm proud. Is Representative Horsford with us, Jerry?
Yes, he is. He's here.
I am proud to introduce at this time the Honorable Stephen Horsford. He represents the 4th District in Nevada, and he has been a point person in the Congress on the census. Representative Horsford, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, President Morial. It's great to see you. It's great to be on, and for this invitation, along with Ms. Jerry Green and Melanie Campbell, for all of your tremendous work, and every member of the Roundtable for what you've done and will continue to do, and being such great advocates for a fair and complete census count across the country. I'm proud to serve Nevada's 4th Congressional District. I'm the first Black person to represent Nevada in our federal delegation. That was as a result of the 2010 census. And as we like to say, I may be the first, but I will not be the last. But that will only be possible when we have a complete, accurate count for the census. I'm also honored to now serve as the first vice chair for the Congressional Black Caucus, and 57 members strong. We're growing now with Senator Warnock joining us, and I want to thank everyone for their efforts there as well. As everyone knows, January 6th, many of my colleagues and staff experienced a deadly insurrection that put a spotlight on the damage that's been caused over the past 4 years under what I believe to be a racist and dangerous former president. Before his departure, Donald Trump used his bully pulpit to encourage a coup to incite violence in our nation's capital. And I can honestly say that this horrifying event that took place on January 6th was a very frightening day, obviously, for all of us, not only on Capitol Hill, but across this country. At one moment, we were told that a security breach was lifted, just to find out that domestic terrorists had violently broken into the Capitol building, overwhelming Capitol Police and creating a very dangerous situation that resulted in 5 deaths. Now a 6th additional life was lost due to suicide and reported recently. This was the first time that the U.S. Capitol had been built since the War of 1812. It was a horrifying event, unprecedented in modern times, and it was directly incited by Donald Trump. Not only did he put members of Congress in danger, but more importantly, he endangered the lives of our hardworking staff across the Capitol Hill complex and Capitol Police and law enforcement that were there that day. So it's very important that this reckless person is held accountable, and anyone else involved, and that they face every consequence that is required. Now, as many of us know, the 2020 election was the most consequential election of our lifetime, specifically for the Black community. Our community faced a lot of challenges when it came to the previous occupant of the White House. So serving as the chair of the Census 2020 Task Force, we saw, and you all helped to eliminate how the Trump administration worked to dissuade our communities from participating in the 2020 census. From rushing the census by refusing to provide census professionals the adequate time that they needed to process data in the middle of a pandemic, but also making it difficult for members of Congress to even conduct our congressional oversight as required under the law. We wait to see the outcome of the 2020 census, and I know now we're looking at results maybe in April now, but I am hopeful that under this new Biden-Harris administration, we will be able to fix a number of the mistakes caused by the Trump administration. Thankfully, we have a new president who has made it a point already to ensure that his administration is as diverse as the country it represents. Serving as the chair for the Congressional Black Caucus's first 100 Days Task Force, my staff and I, along with other members of our task force, have been working with the Joint Center, the Black Talent Initiative, and the Biden-Harris Transition Team, and now the Personnel Office, to ensure that people that look like all of us serve in this new administration. For months, the Black Talent Initiative has been working nonstop to collect resumes of qualified African Americans for key positions throughout the administration, from cabinet to sub-cabinet to agency level positions. It is no secret that members of the Congressional Black Caucus, all of you and Black Americans throughout this country, helped to deliver a victory for President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, and we will hold them to their promise of having an administration that reflects the diversity of our country and those who helped them get there. Already, not only have we elected the first African-American woman as vice president, but just this past week, we swore in the first African-American to serve as the Secretary of the Department of Defense. We're also celebrating the appointment of Kristen Clark from the Lawyers Committee, who will be serving in the Department of Justice. And we'll continue to make sure that African Americans are appointed and hired and are in key decision-making roles. So it's important that the Congressional Black Caucus, and more importantly, all of you, have a strong working relationship with the administration. And I know that the census will be central to all of what we do in the months to come. As you pointed out, President Morial, you know, when we talk about COVID relief and providing assistance and how we're going to recover and build back better in a more equitable and inclusive way, it's largely going to be determined, and already is, some of the funding already is determined by information that comes from the census. I literally was just on the White House, on a call with the White House, talking about the distribution of these vaccines, and they're using information from the census. In this case, the most recent information from 2018 to determine the allocation. So this is an example, a real life example of how this directs or impacts our lives every single day. So I just want to say how proud we are to work with you, President Morial, and the entire Black Census Roundtable. Thank you for allowing me to participate today, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Representative Horsford. We appreciate your leadership and the range of important work that you're doing on talent with respect to COVID, and also with holding those who committed this insurrection accountable in this process. I am now proud to introduce Ajay Sanaya, who's counsel with the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights Under Law, who is going to update us on the National Urban League lawsuit against the census. Ajay, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark, and thanks to all the members of the Black Census Roundtable for convening today. I'm going to try to keep this short. I don't want to rehash a lot of the information that I'm sure folks here are familiar with, but I do think it takes it's worth taking a step back to get a sense of how we got here in the litigation itself and with the census itself. So our litigation began in August after the Trump administration had announced its plans to rush operations in the census. And just to give you a sense of what that meant, the Census Bureau's initial planning had sort of suggested somewhere between 7 and 8 months to conduct all of its data collection and data processing operations. Even after the pandemic caused delays, there was still looking at a time frame of 8 to 9 months. And the rush plan really was trying to consolidate all of that time, all of that operation into just 3 to 4 months of counting operations, which would have had a hugely detrimental impact on the accuracy of the census. So we at Lawyers Committee put together a legal team alongside Brennan Center for Justice, as well as Latham and Watkins, and represented a number of plaintiffs, obviously the National Urban League lead among them, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, who I know are on this call, the NAACP, League of Women Voters, a number of municipalities, including Harris County, Texas, and a number of tribal organizations, including the Navajo Nation. And on behalf of that large coalition, we filed this lawsuit in the Northern District of California. The underlying goal, the end goal for all of the plaintiffs involved, was just to make sure the Census Bureau had the time it needed to be able to conduct its operations effectively and to ensure accuracy of its count. And we were able to achieve quite a bit, especially in the first couple of months of the litigation. So I'm sure folks here know, but the initial sort of victory was a temporary restraining order in early September. And just to give a little sense of what that meant, the census is this behemoth operation, and when you start the census, it takes actually several weeks to get it started. And when you sort of draw down operations, it takes several weeks to draw it down. It doesn't work like a light switch. And so the Bureau was actually planning to start firing enumerators and bringing down operations as early as September 11th, and even earlier than that in certain offices. And our TRO effectively froze that effort and made sure that the Bureau had sufficient staffing all across the country so that it continued doing its count, even if its plan was to finish counting on September 30th, which was its stated plan. We subsequently got a second injunction in late September, which gave us some additional time for counting, and ultimately led to 2 additional weeks of counting on the back end. And just based on the numbers that we looked at, which were being published by the Census Bureau, it was fairly clear that they were nowhere near complete, especially in areas in the southeast and the southwest of the country by September 30th. And so those 2 extra weeks actually were hugely impactful and resulting in hundreds of thousands of people being counted. Following that initial phase where we were focused on the data collection, we then turned our attention to the second stage, which is post-processing. It's post data collection processing. It's highly technical, involves a number of really crucial operations that again help ensure the accuracy of the underlying count. And our goal again was to make sure the Bureau had the time it needed to do that operation. And as with a lot of other things relating to the census over the last 4 years, the post-processing operation was subject to partisan manipulation in ways that are largely unprecedented for the census. Over the course of the late fall and into winter. But we were ultimately successful, and I think that was largely because of a combination of what we were doing in the litigation, as well as pressure coming inside from the Census Bureau at pushing off those efforts to try to speed up that processing and report out faulty, poor data. And you saw that especially come to play in this last week, just before the change in administration. There was an announced effort to put out some pretty poor quality data relating to the estimates of non-citizens in the United States. And that was ultimately defeated. It seems as though it was defeated by folks inside the Census Bureau raising objections to the reporting out of faulty data. And then in the litigation side of things, we were able to work out a stipulation, which the court subsequently ordered, which effectively prevented the Trump administration from putting out any data before January 20th. And that was hugely impactful because obviously the new administration took charge after that and walked back a lot of the manipulative executive orders that the former president had put into place. So, overall, the litigation has been very successful at achieving its goals and additional goals that that were actually the subject of other cases at the same time. Going forward, the litigation is not over yet. We are still, the case is still alive. We're currently in a stay posture and we're sort of waiting to see how things are progressing at the Census Bureau. It's important to note that our goal still remains making sure that the Census Bureau has the time it needs to conduct its operations effectively. And so to that end, we will continue to keep an eye on these things as things move forward, but we're hopeful that this all can be resolved amicably and that we're past the stage of having to deal with sort of dumpster fires as they arise. They seem to have risen every other week under the previous administration. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Jerry to talk a little bit about the accuracy issues.
Okay, can you hear me, guys? Okay. So thank you, Ajay, for the update. The National Urban League has over 5 decades of census advocacy, and this lawsuit will certainly go down as an example of historically undercounted populations standing up for their constitutional right to be fully and accurately counted in the decennial census. One of my former boss, you might have heard of him before, but the Honorable Marion Barry Jr. Once used to tell his staff that a man can't ride your back unless you bend over. And certainly the National Urban League never bends over. So I want to thank you, Ajay, and the litigation team for all your hard work, and Mr. Morial for his leadership. So going to the presentation, right now, the Census Bureau is conducting some of its most important work, processing, tabulating, and cleaning up the data that it collected from your and my households so that it's useful, so that it becomes useful for the constitutional purposes of apportioning seats in the House of Representatives, redistricting, and other uses. The 2020 census, as we've discussed, I won't rehash this, but it's just got to be said again, it was exceptional and phenomenal in the unprecedented challenges it faced. We know them all. And most harmful, of course, was the chaos and confusion sold by a president who, on our backs, weaponized the census for political and partisan advantage. So, some of the questions we got to ask are, how is all this affecting data quality and accuracy for the Black count? And what are the signs we're seeing now that kind of lend themselves to things we need to pay attention to? What's kind of troubling? Moving on, we know that there's no perfect census. People are missed every decade, some more disproportionately than others. Enter the Black population. So we're not going to get statistics on how well population groups responded to the census until either the end of this year or next year, early next year sometime. But there are troubling indicators and signs that we need to pay attention to, given their impact on data quality, representation, federal funding decisions, and the like. Just so you know, the high net undercount of Blacks has been one of the most vexing challenges facing the Census Bureau over the last half century at least. Last decade, the Census Bureau estimated that it missed 16 million people nationwide in the 2010 census. Of this number, nearly 4 million Black people were missed. That's 9.3% of the Black population. Over 15% of Black men at every age category were disproportionately undercounted. In fact, not undercounted, missed altogether. That's between the ages of 18 and 50. And then Black children, 6.3% of young Black children were missed in the last census. These astonishing omission rates are important guideposts against which to measure the accuracy of this census and how it impacts historically undercounted populations. A quick examination of the census counts for the total Black population shows that despite improvements in the last 70 years, the net undercount for the Black population was higher in the 2010 census than any other race group. Further, since Black, and y'all listen to this now, since Black people are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of whites, prison gerrymandering is baked into the census. As Black men, Black women, and even our juveniles who are held in prisons and detention facilities are counted at the location of their prisons and not in their home jurisdictions where the needs are greater. Interestingly, and I find this real interesting, researchers studying the Black undercount speculate that any gains in the overall Black count over the past several decades, any increase, any improvement could be attributed to the ever-growing incarceration rate of African-American men in particular, who, when you know, are counted more accurately in their prison cells to the benefit of the largely white jurisdictions in which they are imprisoned. So they're counted real well in jail, but when they come home, to the number of about 700,000 formerly incarcerated individuals of all races, disproportionately Black, come home each year. That's when the undercounting really begins. Researchers agree that the key measure of census quality is the level of self-response achieved. So when a household fills out the census questionnaire on their own, without somebody knocking on the door, the Census Bureau is able to collect the highest quality population data. In predominantly Black communities, self-response rates in the 2020 census lagged well behind state and national rates. In spite of the Census Bureau's claim that it accounted for 99.9% of households, we still were far behind the count as it pertains to national and state rates. Political representation and government resources are not allocated based on national numbers, rather the local census count. And that's where we get affected most. African Americans were overrepresented in low self-response communities, caught up in homelessness, especially during the pandemic, displaced by gentrification, renters, Black renters, and communities of color who are renters, afraid to share information about their household or the number of persons living in their apartments, college students who left college campuses and dorms in the midst of the pandemic, and so forth. At the close of the 2020 census, according to researchers, the average self-response rate for predominantly Black census tracts nationwide was 56.6%, more than 10 percentage points below the final response rate for the country in the 2020 census. So this is what we're dealing with right off the bat. We're already 10% behind what the national response rate was. So finally, in reference to the 2020 census, Black and other communities of color needed a greater share of door knockers than white areas. Increased door knocking creates a greater risk of undercounts or data quality concerns. Why? Because door knocking typically calls for increased proxy interviews. So what's that? That's when somebody enumerator knocks on your door, hello, nobody answers it. So guess what? They ask anybody who's standing around, hey, you know who lives in this house? How many people live there? What are their race? So you know some of that information is going to be inaccurate. They use unreliable administrative records. They go and find out, okay, federal records on people and try to piece together a household. Or they use imputation, which is essentially guessing the makeup of a household based on the characteristics of their neighbors. In summary, while self-response, that is completing the census on your own, provides the highest quality of data, all other forms of making up a household, the demographics, have lower data quality and pose a risk to census quality. So I'm going to close now and just say that Black people, we know in particular and understand that the story of census accuracy is deep. It's a painful history and story, and it's far more complex than the current 2020 census. Its roots go back for decades. It's ugly. But census accuracy and data are still critical, just as much so, if not more, to our democracy and to voting rights and to representation and federal funding. And as we slowly emerge from the pandemic, we need this data to target COVID-19 vaccinations and to allocate resources to rebuild communities. So my colleagues Fred McBride and Jay June are up next. They're going to update you on must-know developments on the top of the Census Bureau's agenda that could have consequential impacts on redistricting and representation. So I'll turn it over to Fred. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. And let me say thank you to Mark Morial and the National Urban League. It's been a pleasure working with you over these past 2 years and continued work with you as we get ready for the redistricting cycle. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fred McBride. I'm the Redistricting and Voting Rights Policy Specialist for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. What I'd like to spend the next few moments discussing are redistricting, the projected redistricting timeline, given some interesting developments as of late, and what you can do now, as well as going into this redistricting cycle. Let me begin by saying first, it was a great opportunity to work with some of you on this very call that I've been in cars with and I've been in forums with, along with the National Urban League, discussing the census and the importance of the census. What I was so happy to see us do, we didn't just discuss apportionment and we didn't just discuss, I should say, the money. We also added in the representation piece. And for years before, that was always something that was sort of slid over. But this year, we really honed in on how the census relates to representation. And on that front, let's talk about representation. After the census count every 10 years, and thank you, all of us, for the work we put in ensuring a fair and accurate count last year amidst the pandemic. We were able, whether virtually or what have you, to get public education out there and advocacy around getting a fair and accurate census count. After that census count, which we're in the process of now, apportionment or reapportionment, Congress is going to divide 435 states among the 50, 435 representatives, I should say, among the 50 states. So every state, based on population, is going to get a number. That number is going to tell all of us how many House seats. That's apportionment. How many House seats per state? Some are going to stay the same. Some are going to lose. Places like Texas and Florida and North Carolina, they're going to gain seats. That's apportionment. As a redistrictor, that's fine. That's telling me Georgia, for example, may keep their 14 House seats. That does nothing for me in the drawing. The drawing, I need more data. That comes out a few months after the apportionment data. That's voting age population data, that's population data by race and ethnicity, and that's tables of data that can help describe these communities that I'm trying to draw. That drawing of these districts is redistricting. So that's the distinction. One is the assigning of the seats, apportionment. The other is the drawing of the districts. That's redistricting. And in most states, that's done by the state legislature. So we all know the party that's in control of the state is controlling the redistricting there. I will account for some 8 or more states that have engaged in or passed laws for independent redistricting commissions that are supposed to take the bias and partisanship out of the redistricting process. So apportionment and redistricting. Let's focus a little on redistricting. I did say we're going to get numbers as to how many House seats every state gets. Once we get that, we wait for the PL data. It's called PL 94-171. Just say the redistricting data files. We'll get that months later. Then we'll have this information to try to craft plans, go out to the communities, work with groups, and say, hey, this is what we think is a fair plan. Take a look at it, tell us what you think, and then let's present this to the state. And I seem to be talking about congressional and statewide plans, please don't forget your county commissions. Please don't forget your city councils, and please don't forget your city council, your school boards. Those are important as well. All of this redistricting has to take place. Now, apportionment and redistricting. As of yesterday, we were told, due to the pandemic, and this has been an unusual redistricting cycle, we're going to get apportionment data April 30th. First it was January, then it was February, then it was March 6th. Now we're told it's April 30th. So by April 30th, hopefully, we'll know how many House seats all of the 50 states will earn. That's not enough for me to draw. Remember, as I said, I've got to now wait for the Census Bureau to release the redistricting files. That may be July 30th. That may be August. That may be September. That may be problematic the later it comes, because in many of these states, some states it may not matter, but in an ordinary year, were there no pandemic, we would have had the seats, assignments. Every state would know how many House seats they have. And then by April, we would get the redistricting files, and people like me go to work and start drawing plans. Okay, it's a little different. So now we're not going to get apportionment to April 30th, and we'll get redistricting data files sometime this fall, maybe late summer. And as Jerry indicated, hopefully by the end of the year, maybe next year. What does that mean for states? Some states have big elections coming up. They need to hurry up and draw these districts. Some states all have, in any race, candidate qualifying deadlines. There are things that they're about to bump into, and I want to be mindful of this. This will be the very first redistricting in my lifetime, and for many of you, without Section 5. Because of the Shelby v. Holder decision in 2013, we used to have a fail-safe. The Department of Justice could stop something we deemed nefarious that would dilute minority voting strength by way of a redistricting plan or something. They could stop it, and we could participate in that stop. We don't have that anymore. So we've got to stop it now. So while all of this is going on, we've got to be concerned not just about congressional plans and statewide plans. We've got to be concerned about local plans. We've got to be concerned about the county commissions. We've got to be concerned about that school district that has never been able to elect a candidate of choice. All of that is going on at the same time. And now without Section 5, we've got to advocate for hearings, because once you work with a group like Lawyers Committee, National Urban League, LDF, anybody out there, once we craft a plan that we think is fair, we want to present that plan to legislatures, school board districts, county commission districts. We want to present these plans, so they've got to have hearings. We don't know of a hearing schedule. We don't know, and there's no Section 5 there that's going to sort of mandate it. So we've got to advocate for hearings. There's a lot of work ahead. And with all of this, if I haven't given you enough on you, if I haven't put enough on your plate, with all of this, as my colleague will be speaking after my segment here, we want an accurate census. Not accurate in terms of getting out and counting people. Now the processing of that data. And because of Title I concerns and Title 13 concerns, and because of privacy and confidentiality, we've got to ensure that that data cannot be manipulated such that they find out who I am and who you are. And my colleague will be discussing disclosure avoidance. Don't get me wrong, I do want the census to hurry up and get this data so we can meet these deadlines and we can work in communities for fair plans, but I want the data to be accurate. And I want it to best reflect that community. So don't just give me something, because without good data, I cannot draw you a good and fair plan. So I want to be mindful of the disclosure avoidance conversation that's coming up after my segment ends in a few seconds. With that, what can you do? Keep your eyes and ears open. There is so much conversation around redistricting. And just because you hear about plans, pay attention, because a lot of these redistricting plans also include other things that we tend to overlook sometimes in the news articles. Polling place consolidations, polling place closings, annexing new territory, all of those things that Section 5 used to account for, you can see those things pushed into a redistricting bill. And then you find later, wait a minute, they're closing my polling place and I've got to drive 5 miles now. Those things happen. So pay attention, keep your eyes and ears open. Get with an organization, get with National Urban League, get with Lawyers Committee, you know, I won't be jealous. Get with someone and participate, because I draw plans. I sit in front of my computer and I draw plans, but I don't know your community better than you do. I've lived a lot of places. I don't know your community better than you do. You know it better than me. So when I draw that plan, I'm going to give it back to you and say, tell me what I did right. Tell me what I did wrong. And then let's go to a hearing and let's present that. And as a last front, there's litigation. There are enough lawyers here. I don't need to tell you about that. We don't want to sue, but if we have to sue, we will sue, okay? And on that note, let me say, I'll close by saying, we have a tremendous opportunity to really advocate for fair redistricting plans. What you did last year during the primary, getting out there during a pandemic, registering voters, voting, and then engaging in voting with absentee voting, dropping them off somewhere, coming out in November, large turnout, then turning around in January and coming back again, you really showed the power that we have. Let's take this opportunity to extend that into these legislatures, into these school boards, into these city councils, that we are watching you and we're going to participate in those plans. Districts aren't drawn for elected officials, they're drawn for people. And I'll close with that and pass it on to my colleague, Jay June. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you so much for that, that fabulous tee up, Fred. There's a lot to cover today, so apologies in advance if I speak rather quickly. My name is Jay June Lee. I'm at the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Equality, and I'm delighted and immensely grateful to be here to talk about disclosure avoidance. Next slide. Great, we can skip this one too. Great, so starting off with a fundamental challenge. As we know, as discussed, the decennial census is a vast and complex operation to count everyone, every person once and only once in the right place. Hopefully that's the goal. And in publishing the data, the Bureau faces a fundamental challenge. And that's, how do you publish data that is accurate enough or fit for use for purposes such as redistricting and the enforcement of civil rights laws, as Fred was mentioning, while also adequately preserving the confidentiality of respondents in the data set? Because the problem is that the more statistics that are published and the closer those statistics match the underlying sensitive census data, the greater the probability that a bad actor or an external actor can reconstruct, I'll talk a bit more about this in a second, reconstruct the underlying data and identify individual census respondents. To use a really rough analogy, it's a bit like how a complex crossword might be easier to fill out or complete if it came pre-filled with a large number of correct answers. Again, a very rough analogy. Next slide. So I just want to be clear, this isn't a new problem. This is a problem that the Bureau has been dealing with since at least the 1930s. So over the decades, the Bureau has been trying various different approaches to what are called disclosure avoidance techniques to address the problems. And this includes methods that the Bureau used in the 2010 census called swapping. Without going into too much detail, swapping worked by identifying a household or households with a high probability of being re-identified and swapping them, usually with the characteristics of another household nearby. For example, the 2020 census show that the sole residents of Liberty Island are a 63-year-old and 50-year-old Asian couple. In reality, the sole occupants, David and Deborah Lushingers, are white and 59 and 49 years old respectively. So there's been what's been called swapping going on here. So there have been advances over the last 10 years and obviously the last couple of decades in computer science and statistical techniques, along with the growing abundance of personal information online and from commercial providers. And these present new and evolving threats to confidentiality. As the Bureau's internal research has shown, and led them to believe that the current disclosure avoidance methods, I mean swapping, aren't sufficient for the 2020 census and beyond. That's their opinion. And for example, the Bureau found that they were able to accurately re-identify the name of individual respondents, their sex, race, age, and ethnicity, and the block in which they lived. And they could do this for 17% of the population. That's about 52 million people. Just a quick note, I think I personally agree that swapping as used in the 2010 census is no longer adequate for the times we live in, but I did want to also mention that there's some disagreement even among stakeholders about this issue and about differential privacy, which is my next slide. Next slide, please. So differential privacy, what is it? Differential privacy is a mathematical framework that the Bureau has been using to navigate this new challenge. The Bureau announced plans in 2018 to rely on this mathematical framework called differential privacy to manage confidentiality risks by introducing a tunable amount of what is called noise into statistics. I'll talk a bit more about this in a second. Next slide, please. And the Bureau can, if you look here, the Bureau can dial the noise up and down to change the balance of data utility and privacy laws. They do this through the variable epsilon, or what is called the privacy loss budget, and this controls the balance. And if you look at the simplified figure over here, you can see a curve. On the one end, you have perfect data utility and absolute privacy loss. On the other end, on the other extreme, you have perfect privacy but unusable data. Again, the goal is to find the right balance. A reason why the Bureau adopted differential privacy is that because it allows the Bureau to measure and to calibrate that balance in ways that they weren't able to do so in the past. Now, there are divergent opinions, including among stakeholders, and I believe at the Bureau as well, but what the appropriate balance is between data utility and confidentiality. And just before I go on, I just want to note two things really quickly. And as Jerry Green so excellently described, there are deep underlying issues with census accuracy, differential undercounts, and other issues in the census data that already existed before disclosure avoidance. So in other words, disclosure avoidance is not the only source of statistical error, but it is one of them. And differential privacy, the mathematical framework that I mentioned, is just one piece of this overarching disclosure avoidance system that the Bureau is using. And the disclosure avoidance system includes other steps that also contributes to distortions in the data. Next slide, please. Great, so the point of data utility, I just want to make 2 points on data utility. The first one is that differential privacy, differentially private data rather, are more accurate for larger geographic units and densely populated areas. If you go to the next slide, please. For the general analogy that I like to think about is, again, this is a very rough analogy. The 2020 data is going to have a fairly minimal impact on the utility of statistics at a state level, but relatively far larger impact on the block level. So there's different levels here. So again, a really rough analogy here. From a distance, you can see this picture has got fantastic detail and a proximity to reality, but the moment you kind of zoom in and into the details, you see it's a bit imprecise. What you thought were human beings are actually blobs and lines. And again, this is already a rough way of thinking about it. If you go to the next slide, please. This is kind of what it actually starts to look like. Now this slide shows different charts comparing the quote unquote before and after, as it were, of the actual counts of the 2010 census, the actual counts of the 2020 census, and how they changed after the 2020 disclosure avoidance system was applied. The actual 2010 counts are in the unshaded boxes over here, and the differentially private data are shown using the red and blue bars. What I'd ask people to really pay attention to is the general trend rather than the exact values and magnitude. The variations shown here are using a privacy loss budget that I just randomly chose. There are different ranges here again. And then the Bureau has made improvements since they've put this data out in 2019. We don't quite know what the final privacy loss budget will be. But as you can see, there's quite a bit of agreement at the state level, even at the county level. But once you start going down to the city level, there's a bit of discrepancy. For example, the age variations here, for example, that show a very different picture after DAS and before DAS. And and if you see at the bottom right-hand corner, this is Highland County in Virginia, which is far less populous than Fairfax County, which is in the bottom left. And you can quite see that there's a bit of variation in Highland County over there, which is far greater. And sorry, I'm kind of moving through these very quickly, which kind of brings me to the next point here. If you go to the next slide, please. So yeah, again, I say the exact same thing. It's more important to pay attention to the trends and the exact values here. And what we see here is a trend, is a variation in subpopulations. And as you can see in the graph in the middle there, Black people in counties, there's a bit of variation that increases the smaller the population is. So at the top there, you see around the 100,000 marks. There isn't that much distortion, but further down you go, there's a bit of skew going both. That decreases the population count of Black people in counties negatively, but also on the other end in terms of increasing it. So it goes both ways, but yeah, so both increases and decreases in population sizes there that can also lead to a very different picture at these very granular levels of what's the subpopulation and the demographic composition of blocks look like at these granular levels. So yeah, going on to the second slide here, and on to my second point. As I mentioned, differential privacy is just one key of the disclosure avoidance system for the 2020 census. And there are other steps that cause significant distortions. Some of these are systematic biases. So going on to the next slide here. Yeah, just going on to this sort of box and whiskers charts here. If you look on the distribution on the left-hand side here, this shows the difference in the populations in terms of absolute change and absolute population numbers. And what this is generally trying to show, on the right, you see the relative change. So what this is generally trying to show is one of the systematic biases, that if you just take one thing away from this, that the systematic bias, there's a shift in which small, sparsely populated areas tend to gain population, while densely populated areas tend to lose population. So there's a sort of shifting in population, and a systematic bias. So that's kind of the main key takeaway from this sort of slide here. Again, sorry, I'm quickly moving through this rather quickly. And going on to the next slide. So why do we care about this? Why is this all important? And the one example I just want to highlight is thinking about estimating disease or rate estimates. If you have a systematically biased population count, and population counts from the census are what are called denominators. These can create biased rates of disease estimates. And so what is this going to do? If you have systematic biases in both the count of populations and also subpopulations, these are going to impact our understandings of health disparities between places and between groups, and social determinants and health trends over time. And so there's some really, really deep consequences here that we have to kind of think about. Sorry, going on to the next slide here. Again, so the really important thing is that there's a dual mandate that the Bureau has in requiring to balance data utility and confidentiality. And the census data have a lot of statutory purposes, some of which Fred really rightfully outlined, including redistricting, and also want to mention the Voting Rights Act. So if there are overly inaccurate race and ethnicity data, this could impinge the ability of redistricting experts and redistrictors to create, for example, majority-minority districts that are designed to prevent the disenfranchisement of voters of color. So in short, if the privacy loss budget for the 2020 census was set too heavily in favor of confidentiality and against data utility, redistrictors and civil rights communities may not be able to adequately enforce legal standards prohibiting discrimination and voting and redistricting processes. In publishing census data, so the Bureau has to balance the interests of statutory uses of census data, including the Voting Rights Act, with the strong legal requirements that it has to protect the confidentiality of census responses. Next slide, please. So I'll go through this really quickly. I kind of keep mindful of time. So since the new disclosure avoidance system was announced, the Bureau has been attempted to balance these varying and oftentimes conflicting expectations and beliefs for what is necessary and fair, amidst facing and admittedly falling short of meeting very difficult communication and outreach challenges. As of January 2021, the Bureau has been engaging stakeholder groups, including FECPEs, the Federal State Cooperative for Population Estimates Working Group, and other groups. And early on in 2020, we recognized that civil rights groups weren't at the table for these conversations and decision-making around the 2020 census, or not really as much as they should be. So since then, there's been a small group of engaged civil rights organizations who meet every other week, including Jerry Green and Fred McBride, who I believe are speakers here today. And Janine Abrams-McLean, too, I believe, is on the call here today, kind of thinking about these issues along with other partners too at other civil rights organizations. And we meet with, and there's been a small group of us who also meets with the Bureau regularly. The Bureau has also been holding formal consultations with tribal nations who are also deeply impacted by the disclosure avoidance systems through formal consultations, and they've been engaging the Census Advisory Committees on the 2020 DAS, but unfilled vacancies, and the National Advisory Committee has prevented from that specific committee from relaying formal recommendations to the Bureau on the 2020 disclosure avoidance system. So just the last slide over here, just on timeline, I'll just highlight one important thing. Next slide, please. I don't have too much time to get into the detail here, but the one thing I just wanted to note is the most important thing for the 2020 disclosure avoidance system, and the most important timeline, milestone, is the redistricting data. The 2020 disclosure avoidance system doesn't impact the apportionment data. It's not. It's not connected to the apportionment data, but it is connected to the redistricting data. And so the timeline for the disclosure avoidance system is tied to the redistricting data. And from my perspective, thinking purely from disclosure avoidance, it's great that we have more time, but I understand there are implications for redistricting of it there. But so we have more time to work with the Bureau and really get more feedback, make sure that the Bureau gets that balance right. Great. And so, yes, I'll just leave it there, just recognizing time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. At this time, I'm proud to introduce Jericho Richardson, Senior Vice President, National Urban League. She leads our equitable justice and strategic initiatives. Jericho?
Thank you, Mark. I just want to thank all of our participants, presenters, affiliate leaders, Representative Horsford, and of course, our co-conveners, President Morial and President Campbell, for joining us today. We've heard how important census data quality is to racial justice, voting rights, and economic equity. And it's so important for us to continue to engage in conversations around census, data quality, and be mindful of the impact on Black communities. The National Urban League will provide documents to you within the next 24 hours on differential privacy and some other topics to facilitate discussions within your own organizations as we prepare for census advocacy and any follow-up. Please share these materials with your colleagues who's working on redistricting and census data quality. And finally, the National Urban League is establishing a 2020 census question box to respond to your questions regarding differential privacy or other census concerns. That email address is 2020census@nul.org. We'll also share the email address with all of our participants today when we send out those documents. Now, Reverend Young, will you give us a final spiritual offering as we go our separate ways in unity? Thank you all for joining us.
Let us pray. Eternal God, we thank you for this time and the information you shared to us. Now, God, strengthen us, strengthen our minds, and strengthen us physically, that we may do the work that is before us, and that we be able to accomplish the challenges that are before us, knowing through you all things are possible. Now may your grace and your sweet communion, your grace and your mercy abide with us and keep us as we journey further throughout this day and throughout this week. We ask in your name, who is above every name. Amen.